Fighting for Veterans, a candid conversation with David Johnstone. In this episode of Once a Warrior, Life Beyond the Uniform, we sit down with David Johnstone, the Northern Ireland Veterans Commissioner, to get straight to the point about why did he take on this role, what real change does he plan to deliver, and how he will fight to make life better for veterans in Northern Ireland. No fluff, no politics, just honest answers about who he is, the challenges, the battles ahead, and the future he's working to build. Welcome to this episode of Once a Warrior, Life Beyond the Uniform, where I am very privileged to be interviewing our next Veterans Commissioner, Mr. David Johnstone. David, congratulations.
Hi Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. I, being a veteran in Northern Ireland and also as part of your staff, I'm not going to lie about that, have some questions for you today, because I know the sorts of questions that veterans will be asking about what they will want to know about our new Veterans Commissioner, your background. So we're going to delve a little bit into the life of David Johnstone and what's brought you to be our new Veterans Commissioner.
No problem at all. Looking forward to it. The Stephanie Strange's been in this seat, looking over at that seat for a change.
Well, you know, I was RMP, so it's been a bit of a time since I've done an interview, so hopefully
lights been shining in my face, so I'm getting worried here maybe at this moment in time.
Well, everything is being recorded, so you know, everything can be used in evidence. Just let's leave it at that. But what drove you to serve in the military in the first place?
Yeah, good question. I think initially it was just as an 18-year-old, the sense of adventure. Myself and a friend of mine decided to join up. We liked the idea of the military. It's something I had been interested in, but not really thinking it was a career. And then the opportunity, I suppose, to earn some extra income, get some travel that would obviously come from being in what was then the Territorial Army, is probably what motivated me initially. It certainly wasn't any grand motivation to serve Queen and country at that point. We did have a number of people in the military in our family history. On my mum's side, her great-grandfather passed away toward the end of the First World War over in Ypres. And I then had an uncle who was Irish Guards for many years, another uncle who was Ulster Defence Regiment, and my own brother was Ulster Defence Regiment as well as then Royal Irish Regiment. So I suppose we had a fair bit of military in the family, but that wasn't the motivation at the time. As I say, adventure, get out, earn a bit extra money, and the tax-free bounty was very attractive to an 18-year-old.
Absolutely, and you mentioned that a friend joined at the same time. Would you have joined? Had your friend not joined at that time?
Probably, because he didn't last too long. He met a lassie and fell in love, and left me on my own then pretty quickly after that. So I probably would have joined. I did have some people I knew were in the company I joined. So I probably would have, but it was easier to join with a friend.
Absolutely, no, definitely does. It's always nice to have that camaraderie and somebody to lean on as soon as you go through into the unknown. So you mentioned travel and you joined to see the world and to go places and adventure. So where did that travel bring you to?
Goodness, a lot further than I thought, I think, initially. As well as the different military exercises, I also played for the Territorial Army UK football team, which meant we did some travel with that as well. But in terms of exercises, Canada, Gibraltar, Germany, the Falkland Islands, and was also among the first British troops ever into Ukraine. I think from memory about 1999, we did an exchange programme, and our annual camp that year was in a village called Lviv, up near the Polish border. So plenty of travel came with the TA service.
Now, in fairness, I'm ex-regular, but I was in the TA beforehand as well, and know that adventurous training and exercises do bring you in far-flung places. I've been Bolivia, Kenya, to name but a few, and it's a great advantage of the military, but also that comes to operations. Now, you have been on deployments as well. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that? Yeah,
I'll clarify adventure training as well, because a bugbear of mine was in nearly 26 years of service, I didn't have one adventure training camp at all. Or exercise.
That's because Queen's OTC stole them all.
Well, I would say they stole a fair few of them, but I think the hierarchy felt that my involvement in TA football was my adventure training.
Okay.
So unfortunately I never got to partake in those wonderful adventure training, but hey ho. But so in terms of operations, 2004 was mobilised to go to Iraq on Optelic 4. We first sent some troops in 2003 during the warfighting phase. I was recovering from a broken leg playing football, surprise, surprise, up at the depot. Actually, it happened up in Ballymena. Wasn't able to go, much to my annoyance. My brother, Ian, who had been a regular and then had joined the TA, got mobilised, so he went. So when 2004 came along and I was mobilised, I was delighted to get the opportunity to actually go. And I think, probably like many reserve soldiers, it was the opportunity, Rachel, to test yourself. You know, you had done all the training. I'm old enough to remember back in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, you'd bump into our colleagues in the Ulster Defence Regiment at weekends in Ballykinler or at McGilligan, and there was the friendly "you'll do rightlies" versus the Saturday, Sunday soldiers and all the banter. So there was always that curiosity of how will you actually fare on operations? Can you hack it? Can you make the right decisions? And then as an officer, can you lead men in a combat environment? And that was sort of something that I was keen to test.
No, absolutely. And as a regular who's deployed with TA soldiers, as well as known there, now reservists, with the whole One Army concept, absolutely. It's like everything. You get really, really good TA reservist soldiers, and then you get some that maybe aren't as experienced as what you might like. But having said that, you have to put your trust in the people left and right of you whenever you're in operations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I used to describe it as, if you take the regular army in terms of their ability and training, you've got some obviously exceptional down to some maybe not, and then you put your reserve in there, and I think the better reserve soldiers are certainly better than if you like the lower end of the regulars, but then the lower end of the TA potentially through fitness and things like that are probably lower. So that middle band, and certainly we found in Iraq, particularly in Basra, we were doing escort duty around our AOR, and numerous senior officers commented on that the Rangers or the privates that were doing escort duty, because there were Army reservists, and many of them had high-powered jobs. There were executives, there were hired taxpayers, lawyers, doctors, all different people like that. That even just the very conversations in the back of the snatches on the way into Basra, rather than with maybe the usual sort of squaddies, 18, 19, 20-year-old, our guys were talking about the stock market and what was happening with inflation, and some guys were speaking 4 or 5 different languages. So a completely different environment that the TA soldier, the reservist, I think can bring to the operational environment. Absolutely,
and just touching on that as well, because I know certainly from my time in Afghanistan, particularly medics, as in the profession, the anaesthetists, the doctors, they were called out because they were guaranteed to get trauma there. So they would come out, do short tours, but they worked hard during those short tours. And without those expertise key sets, absolutely critical to the combat effectiveness. So the necessity for reservists and specialities is known. So you just need to be there, do your job and do it as best you can. Absolutely. But that leads me on to my next question, because you mentioned that there can be a bit of snobbery between the regular army and reservist side of things. You come from a reservist background, but for this role as commissioner, what do you think the best attributes you bring to the role, having come from a reservist background?
So I think you've alluded to the fact that when regulars have been in operations and have worked then with reservists, I think by the time the tour ends, the respect for reservists has probably gone up in most circumstances. And I think that has helped change that perception. We used to say that the regulars and the reservists together is the British Army. It's not one or the other. And the size of the British Army now, it needs both. It needs the reservists to step in and backfill and to do certain roles. So I think from my point of view as the Commissioner, the new Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland, I like the fact that I've served through, if you want to call the Op Banner years. Now I wasn't actually on Op Banner officially. Well, that's a sore point for some of the old TA soldiers who obviously would have carried live rounds and done escort duty to and from Ballykinler and McGilligan, certainly in St Lucia Barracks. The TA soldiers would have done exactly the same shifts guarding the camp as the Ulster Defence Regiment, but we were never officially on Op Banner. So having lived through, if you like, the troubles, and having carried a personal weapon, having been targeted by Republicans at one point, searching under the car, changing movements, I at least have an understanding of what those soldiers who served here during the troubles went through. But then having been a reservist, having been to Iraq on operations, having worked with the regular army, then I also know what it's like for those soldiers who, post-op banner, have been to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and then had to come back to Northern Ireland and try and maybe reintegrate into society if they've decided to leave the military. So I've I think I've not unique in any stretch of the imagination, but I think my experience is quite varied, and I think I can bring that to this role.
No, I agree, because at the end of the day, you've been targeted. You've carried a PW, personal protection weapon here in Northern Ireland. For all intents and purposes, you've lived the threat level without the operational experience coming with that, but very, very close. So it's, I think, from my experience working with veterans in Northern Ireland, being able to understand the challenges of home service regiments like the Ulster Defence Regiment, Royal Irish Home Service, and others that served over here and have come back to live here, as well as having the more, what we would term, modern day conflict experience in Iraq. It's a nice crossover to be able to understand just the complexity of all the different challenges, because no veteran walks the same path.
Yeah.
So the big question then, at what point did you realise that actually I could be the strong voice that veterans need and could be the next Veterans Commissioner?
Yeah, it came about by accident, really. I'm a friend with one of the veterans champions, and he invited me to the Basra to Helmand and back event at Stormont, an event obviously organised by the Veterans Commissioner's Office. So I wasn't even sure if I was going to attend or not, and I mentioned my brother, obviously, who had served, and I contacted him, and if he had said no, I may not even have attended the event, but he said, yeah, let's do it. So up we went to Stormont. I hadn't been hugely active in the veteran space, maybe go to the odd event, the odd get together, but certainly not massively active, just busy with family, with football, with my business. But I went to that event, and in probably true sort of military fashion, walked into the Great Hall at Stormont. The first person I met was an RQMS who I'd served in Iraq with. Hadn't, I don't think, seen him for the 20 odd years since we were both in Iraq together. And there we were, standing in the Great Hall, chatting away about Iraq and all the rest of it. And it just brings back that camaraderie, that sense of belonging, that sense of identity that you have. And then during the course of the evening, it was mentioned that there was a vacancy, that Danny had stepped down. And I suppose just sitting listening to the speeches, meeting old friends. And a few people on the night said to me, would you consider it? You would have a lot of the skills that the veterans need. So I think that was the first time I really looked at it and went, is this a possibility? And then talked to some people and made an application. And I really did feel as if I could give something back. I've been quite fortunate in life. I'm 54 years old now. As I say, my best years are behind me physically, and it's a matter of, I've been very fortunate through my own military experience and career. I think it's helped shape me into the person I am, and there was a genuine desire to give something back, and can I make a difference? Can I help be that voice, be that champion, be that advocate for veterans in Northern Ireland and help make it a better place for them? And I've always been fascinated, Rachel, by how the Americans and the Canadians treat their soldiers and veterans compared to how we do it in the UK. And in America, you hear it in the various films, thank you for your service. I mean, we just don't do that in the UK. And I remember being in a train station in North London and seeing two young fellas come in, and they were clearly going to, post-Iraq, so they're going to Afghanistan, and they were like, 18, 19-year-old, all their gear, still white as a sheet, so they clearly hadn't been out yet. And they went to pay for their coffee, and the lady behind the counter went, no, that's on us, thank you for your service. I remember sitting there thinking, that was me all those years ago, and thinking what was going through their minds, and just that small generosity from the person behind the till, that must have meant a lot to those young fellas as they were heading out. So all that came together to say, let's apply and see if we're successful. Try and make a difference.
No, that's really good, because I know just when you mentioned that, it brings back sort of memories of my own experience coming back. It was actually on an R&R from Afghanistan, and I got off a train in Edinburgh, and there was a lady came up. I was still in my uniform. I hadn't slept in about 3 days, and she came up and said, "Thank you for your service." And you're kind of taken aback by a little bit, because you're just not used to it in this country, particularly in Northern Ireland, where you're told to, you know, don't disclose your service. It's all this now. It's changing a lot, thank goodness. But no, I absolutely agree. Little did we know that night that we would find ourselves a new Veterans Commissioner, but I'm glad you came in the end.
I can remember you were doing reception when I walked in. You were helping check people in.
Yeah, I didn't want any imposters, you see, that's what it was. But you got through the door anyway, so that was a bit... Anyhow, moving on, what do you think the biggest issue facing veterans in Northern Ireland is right now, and do you think it can be fixed?
That's a really good question. So I think if you take just the veteran space in general, I would probably say communication.
Okay.
And within that communication is establishing just exactly how many veterans are there in Northern Ireland. And there's certainly an intense debate that is raged before my time as Commissioner, and is still raging with the various stakeholders. You know, is it 70,000, 80,000, as high potentially as 130, 140,000?
And we just don't know.
And we just don't know. So in terms of a challenge facing the veteran community in this office is, you know, we're actually not communicating with the vast majority of veterans in Northern Ireland. I estimate probably around 9,000 to 10,000 are on our various databases. So that means 1 in 10 veterans we're not communicating with. Now, of course, some of those veterans may well be happy, they've moved on with their life, they don't have any issues, and they don't want to be contacted. But I think it's a challenge that we make sure that any veteran who needs support, who has issues, and needs to be pointed in the right direction, whether it be health, whether it be education, employment, housing, whatever it may be, I want to make sure that they know where they can get the help they need. So I think that's the overarching challenge. The other big elephant in the room is, of course, legacy, which is certainly on veterans' minds at the minute, and I think will continue to be a big challenge as we move forward in the years ahead.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to come back to legacy, but I'm going to go back to your first answer with communication, which conveniently comes into why we're sitting here today. You came in on our first meeting and with your sort of, I would say a list of demands, but it wasn't that bad. It was more your aspiration list, and that was communication and podcasts. So why is this podcast series so important to you as our new Veterans Commissioner?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital. As I sat over Christmas looking at the information that was been given to me in the briefing pack from Alan, and seeing how we communicate with the current community, you know, it was clear that we've got an older generation that mightn't even have email. We then have our newsletter that goes out. We then have obviously our Facebook, and then we have the various other stakeholders, the regimental associations, the Royal British Legion, the Veteran Welfare Service. They all have databases. But I was like, how do we communicate with the wider community? And I think there is a really important need for messaging of what did it mean to serve in Northern Ireland. And I don't just mean Up Banner, but Up Banner is very, very, very important as to what was the real story of the Troubles. But then for those that served pre-Up Banner and since Up Banner in likes of Iraq and Afghanistan, how do we get their story out to the next generation? And certainly the next generation are not looking at newsletters, probably not looking at emails to find information. They're on social media. And podcasting, I think, is absolutely the medium of the future in terms of building an audience. And it was very clear when I looked at the current landscape that if we're going to tell the stories of veterans, make sure that the correct story of Up Banner is told, but just let veterans tell their stories. I think you'll agree with this, Rachel. For many veterans, the one thing they want above all is recognition.
Absolutely.
They want just society to say, you know what, we respect you and understand that you made a decision to put on a uniform, and we use the term service. Well, that service means that soldiers and obviously sailors and airmen, etc., they were sent into military operations, into combat on behalf of the nation. That sometimes gets lost, I think. You know, when the government sends soldiers and the military personnel in general, they're going because they're serving the rest of society that don't have to go. and they go and put their lives on the line. You know, their lives are disrupted, and what happens post-conflict with all the, you know, the health issues that come, that's all done on behalf of everyone else in society who doesn't have to go and fight those wars. And I think that gets lost sometimes. And therefore, to tell those stories and let veterans feel recognised, let them feel appreciated, I think a podcast is a great way to let them tell their stories and also get that message out to the younger generation.
And also to record those stories as a part of history as well, because I know recently you were at the birthday celebrations of a veteran, RAF veteran who turned 100, who had a spectacular story in World War II on airfields and things, and without those stories being recorded, they're lost.
Absolutely. You know, for Fred Jennings, 100 years old, I mean, still able to carry on a in-depth conversation. It was certainly a great honour for me on behalf of the office to present him with a picture frame of all the different puppies since the 1920s and present that to him. And I've heard since that he really appreciated the gift on behalf of the office. So yeah, we've managed to capture, you know, his story, and that is just so important going forward. Absolutely.
So veterans here in Northern Ireland, what do you think differs for veterans living in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK?
Yeah, I think there's very often a lack of understanding, not just from successive British governments, but also from in some cases the wider military family of those protected in the Ulster Defence Regiment who didn't just come here for a 6 or 7 month tour and then head off to somewhere else, back to the safety of the UK or to another exercise somewhere. Those that served here in Northern Ireland, they lived here 24/7, and I don't think there's sometimes a real understanding or grasp of what it meant for 24/7 to be in an operational environment, and that's really what it was. And therefore there was no going back into camp. If we were in Basra, I mean, it was great when you got back into camp. You know, you had a 3-mile perimeter around you that was obviously guarded initially by the RAF regiment, and then you had internal checkpoints. You mean you had 3 checkpoints before you got to Allenby Lines where we stayed. Yeah. So when you got back to your billet at night, I mean, you're relatively safe. For Ulster Defence Regiment soldiers and the Greenfinch ladies that served, when they were coming home is probably when they were at the greatest risk. Yeah. When they went to work in the morning is when they're at the greatest risk, and particularly for part-time soldiers who had a day job that took them in automatically into all different parts of Northern Ireland. That pressure, the stress, and the impact it had on their families, that's a whole untold story. I think the impact on the families of those that served. So I think that's a unique challenge in terms of the Ulster Defence Regiment and those that served, or regular soldiers who have now decided to move over here and live still with that threat. That's probably the biggest challenge I see.
Now all this ties in to that really tricky aspect of being the Northern Ireland Veterans Commissioner compared to the Scottish and Welsh, who don't have to deal with this sort of being legacy. Mm-hmm. Now, you've only been in the job 2 months, and already you have been instrumental in speaking for veterans and standing up for veterans in regards to advocating for them in light of, I'll say, the Clino ruling. Mm-hmm. That obviously shocked many people because bad guys brought guns to a gunfight effectively. What would you say about going forward with legacy and the way it is at the moment to sort of reassure veterans that you've got their back as much as you can do?
Mm-hmm. I was in a meeting with the other 2 Veterans Commissioners from Wales and Scotland last week, and when they were talking about all the issues they face, and then I reminded them I've got this other sort of massive issue of legacy to deal with, and they were like, yeah, okay, fair enough. So like it's a real issue, for sure, and it's an issue that faces all of society. I don't see it just as a unique issue just to veterans, but of course veterans have their take on it. Because it was their service. I think hindsight's always an exact science, and I think it is very challenging that sort of 25 years on from what was termed as the peace process, I think veterans are becoming very angry, very frustrated, at how they are being treated as opposed to the terrorists. And when we had our troubles, we got to a point in the history of this country where wider society was asked to accept a peace process of sort. We were told, well, we have to let the terrorists out of prison. And that's terrorists on both sides of the community.
Yeah.
Had to be let out of prison. That was the price of peace. Those that perhaps still had some evidence against them were given comfort letters, effectively royal pardons. Let's call it spade a spade. They were given amnesties in layman's terms. That was hard for veterans to accept. And yet we were told from a society point of view, you must accept this as the price of peace. We then had those elected to the government of Northern Ireland who clearly had, in many cases, a past in paramilitary groups, and in some cases had carried out atrocities and had been to jail for their atrocities. Again, society was told, you have to accept this as the price of peace. So it's really hard, Rachel, for veterans 25 years on to accept the current landscape, which repeated inquests and a constant targeting of the actions of what are termed as state forces, and yet there's no scrutiny on the terrorists who actually went out to take life, to damage property, and yet those who went out to save life and protect property are somehow now been demonised. And it's not acceptable.
Yeah.
And it won't be acceptable to veterans going forward.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be many veterans disagreeing with your point of view on that one, but certainly it is a bitter pill to swallow. I grew up in the Troubles, I never served. I was just a year younger to be able to vote for or against the Good Friday Agreement. So seeing the protections that soldiers put in and the patrols in the streets growing up, that was my normal then. Mm-hmm. You think, well, I know that they were stopping me from going into where a bomb possibly was side of things. So now that kind of twisting and the experience that we know through the military is particularly bitter.
For many veterans, I'll just add this, for many veterans, they accept that the war, as it was called, is over. There aren't terrorist activities happening in terms of loss of life. But for many veterans, the Republican movement in particular have just moved to a different phase of the war, and it's legal warfare. It's literally carrying on the inverted commas war, but by trying to demonise those who put the uniform on. And that's sad in the sense that the vast majority of those who wore the uniform, whether they lived here in Northern Ireland or came here because they were sent on their deployments, acted with professionalism, acted with a huge degree of restraint, and that seemed to be lost in this new narrative of trying to blame the security forces for the Troubles. And it's a rewriting of history. And while many veterans feel that justice will not be served in Northern Ireland because of decommissioning, because of the on-the-run letters, and even accountability is not going to happen. They're very clear they don't want the narrative to be lost of what it meant for Ulster Defence Regiment and regular soldiers to come across here and other military personnel to serve here, put their life on the line, ultimately to keep the peace.
Absolutely. And even now, that echoes in why most people join the military. It is to try and serve society and potentially pay the ultimate sacrifice for somebody else who either can't or won't side of things. It is deep, it is complicated, and it is not easy. And being fair to you, you're just in the job just over 2 months. But what so far has been the hardest part of this job, and what keeps pushing you moving forward?
The hardest part is probably trying not to eat too much as I've went to all the various big breakfasts in the morning and the various lunches and all the rest of it. So yeah, I've definitely had to up the fitness routine just to keep my fighting weight where it needs to be. But yeah, that's a challenge. That's an easy one to try and overcome. That's just self-will. But I think the initial challenge for me was just trying to understand the landscape. There are a lot of stakeholders in the veteran space here in Northern Ireland. There are statutory bodies, there are third sector charities, and I think for me that initial few weeks was just trying to understand, who was who in the space, who exactly did what, and particularly where services overlap. So you're looking at the regimental associations, you're looking at the Veteran Welfare Service, the good work that Paul Byrne does. There obviously was the OVA and Karen just been set up. So there were some changes in the landscape anyway, and I was really trying to understand all of that for me then to make my assessment at where I felt there were needs where there are overlaps, and really then to decide on where I felt the resources of the office should be put to make the biggest difference for veterans.
No, that's brilliant, and I know I haven't stopped in the last 2 months, so it's been a very, very busy period.
The pace of the leader is the pace of the pack.
Oh my goodness, and you certainly have us running, that's for sure. But that aside, if you could push through one game-changing reform tomorrow, what would that be?
Well, obviously health, if you could wave a magic wand and provide all veterans the health services they need. Okay. Leaving that aside, which I think is the obvious answer, I think housing. I think we do have a need here in Northern Ireland for proper housing and accommodation for veterans, whether that be those who just find themselves in a family situation or a situation in life where they need to go to a safe space for accommodation. I recently was talking to one of our statutory bodies, and they talked about a veteran who had lived nearly 40 weeks in his car in recent years. I find that just shocking. So I think there's a need for there. There's obviously been a loss of the Royal British Legion property up in the North Coast. So I think there is a real need. So for the magic wand, it would be to have some short-term emergency accommodation, maybe some respite accommodation, but certainly better accommodation for veterans in need.
So if just move it, absolutely agree with you, because having a safe space to go is so important to so many, and it's sort of the beginning of being able to develop your life in other ways, being able to have bank accounts, having registration with doctors, being able to get a job. So it is an outstanding issue, definitely. Looking forward into the future, and if you had 30 seconds to tell Northern Ireland's veterans exactly why you do this job, what would you say to those veterans?
To make a difference.
Yeah.
First and foremost, to make a difference. That any veteran who has a need, has a challenge, has an issue, or just needs to connect with the veteran community, they know they can come to our office and we can either help them ourselves or signpost them to an organisation that can help them. But every veteran who has a need should know how to have that need met.
No, absolutely, and that's something that we always strive to do and strive to do better. So you're 2 months into the job. You have had us absolutely running. We've got podcasts going. You have been out doing, I think you've got excess of over 70 engagements in the last 2 months, including face-to-face engagements with veterans, road shows, minister visits, the lot. So you've been really incredibly busy over the last couple of months. So
it's time for a holiday, I think.
Well, what I would say is I think we should definitely come back in another 6 months and do an update podcast to see the here and there and what's been achieved side of things. But certainly you've given us a really good background about why you came here and what you want to achieve during that time. And certainly from a veteran's point of view, you always wonder, okay, how is this new guy going to stand up for me? What are his values and standards and views? So I really do appreciate you being so candid and open. You don't have a political background?
No, never been a member of a political party, never knocked a door in Northern Ireland for a vote for a political party.
So the politics are a complete side. It's sort of your focus is straight down the line, veterans and what's to do best, and articulate that in the best way possible.
Well, just to add, that's obviously not just me, there is the team there. Obviously with yourself and Alan, and certainly both of you have been a superb help, even in the short time in post. I know you're both very passionate about doing what you can for veterans, so I think that makes for a good team. And I know I'm the one that's maybe front and centre, but it's very much a team effort, and I certainly appreciate the work that you and Alan are putting in behind the scenes.
Thank you, I appreciate that. But I suppose just to add on quickly onto that is that some people don't understand the makeup of our office insofar that there's only 3 of us, and your position is in fact part-time as well, because you're the general manager of a local football club as well. So that takes up a lot of your time. But the reassurance aspect of it is that there are veterans in the Veteran Commissioner's office, and we all bring different skill sets that create a round circle, because what I lack in other areas, Alan picks up for, and we have that really good working relationship to try and make sure the most important person in all of this, being the veteran, gets to where they need to be. If we can help, we will.
Absolutely. I mean, if there was a blank sheet of paper and I was designing a veteran's office, would it look exactly as it looks now? Maybe not. But this is the office that's there currently. this is the structure. It'd be great to have more money, more resources, but I firmly believe that with the staff we have, the structure we have, the resources we have, we can make a difference. We can improve veterans' lives. We can make sure we connect people to the right services and be that voice, that advocate, that champion within the office as it now exists.
Yep. Final question. How important do you think it is to have a Veterans Commissioner in Northern Ireland?
Vital, absolutely vital. I think that it is quite a busy landscape because of all the different statutory organisations and then third sort of sector charities. Many of them, well, all of them do a fantastic work, but obviously many of them are trying to ensure that they survive and they get funding. And therefore I think a veteran could perhaps get lost in that search for funding and people obviously looking after their own patch, so to speak. And that's not a criticism, that's just the reality of sort of modern day charities and a shortage of funding. So I think having, what's sometimes referred to as the golden triangle, where you've got the Office of Veteran Affairs, the statutory body under the MOD, you've then got the Veterans Welfare Service, which delivers the main point for the health and finances, and then really underpinning that is the Veterans Commissioner's Office. It is effectively, if you like, the front of house. We help both those bodies, and we are the first place that veterans go to. So I think having that office that can see the landscape and signpost, as well as having hopefully someone that can stand up for them in the public, go in front of the Secretary of State, go in front of the Minister for Veterans and People, and argue the case for veterans. I think that's a very, very important role, and will be increasingly important, I think, as we move forward.
David, thank you so much for sitting down, answering all my questions, and certainly we will come back and ask you some more questions 6 months down the line just to catch up about life as a Veterans Commissioner and how things are going. So thank you ever so much.
I look forward to it.